So in this video, let's consider a big perspective on utilitarianism, namely utilitarianism in the 20th century. The reference paper is Chapter 5 out of the Cambridge Companion to Utilitarianism. So in the 20th century, you could say that utilitarianism kind of exploded. It ramified. It just went off in dozens and dozens of different directions, all kinds of issues with utilitarianism, namely different ways of applying it, different places to apply it, and the complexity of utilitarianism, utilitarian analysis, actually, just went through the roof. And it merged with a lot of statistical analyses, various mathematical kinds of analyses, economics. So it became shall we say, it became spread out, became very popular in political science and economics departments. So it's a major theory. Some people argue that it is really the ethical theory of the 20th century. I'm not sure that's correct, but I would certainly agree that it is a major theory and it is used in government and corporations in a variety of ways to ascertain their ethics and what they should do. Okay, but in any case, so we're dealing with a pretty important legacy of the sort of the classical theories in the Western tradition of ethics. So one way to group it, not the only way, but one way to approach this is to say, well, it kind of developed in two main directions, and well, the nature of, and they are the scope and precision. So as I basically just said, you know, it broader scope, law, political theory, economics. Not only did it broaden out in that scope, but it also narrowed in a way too, because it was really a lot of utilitarians that went and zeroed in on very specific ethical questions, like abortion, euthanasia, questions of suicide, and then, of course, one of the most famous philosophers in the 20th, certainly in the later 20th century, is Peter Singer, and he did, and he works in utilitarian theory, and released some landmark works dealing with the ethics of animals, and he takes a utilitarian perspective of that, picking up from the utilitarian tradition the most you know, an often repeated phrase of Bentham's, and that it's really not about rationality that determines moral standing. It's really about a capacity to suffer. So that's sort of the basic, shall we say, the bottom line predicate is something has moral standing if it can suffer. It doesn't have to have rationality. So that moved away from earlier views and other views that regarded moral standing as somehow connected with having a rational kind of framework, being a free being of reason, kind of like a Kantian, or being able to enter into contracts, being a participant, or in some ways of a deal of some sort, and morality would grow out of that. No, Bentham, and then down the line, Peter Singer, we're talking about, let's do our ethics looking at the notion of suffering as a fundamental predicate to determine moral standing. So bigger in scope and also narrow in focus. So as I said, it went all over the place. And of course, with Singer's thought, you know, you had the introduction of notion of speciesism. So in addition to things like racism and sexism, where, you know, arbitrary means of cutting off the domain of moral standing and privileging certain groups, well then, if you look at the capacity to suffer as an important moral predicate, that determines, that gives rise to another possible prejudice, namely speciesism, where it allows us to critique another prejudice that you know, human beings are the only important species and others are subordinate or in some way. But when you open up the capacity to open up the predicate to the capacity to suffer, well, then that starts to look like an arbitrary moral boundary. Okay, so in addition to this this greater scope and a narrower focus, there was also this greater precision. As I mentioned earlier, utilitarianism made its way and started linking up with mathematics and all these kinds of things. And if you go to the journals that deal with utilitarianism, you can see there's a lot of high-powered mathematics involved. And even in this chapter, there is an attempt to provide some axioms. In other words, a kind of geometric looking a framework for an ethical theory. So this is the real marriage of ethics and science. So like we're a long way from Aristotle with this one. We're closer to the notion of the mathematization of all endeavors in philosophy and even in ethics. Okay, so one can find statements now, just this greater precision. Why was that necessary? Well, if you look at the classic figures in utilitarianism, as great as they may be, nonetheless, and this is common to many traditions, you can find, so we say, different versions and different ideas that are a little bit loose around the edges, and they're talked about as if they're the same thing. So if you go through Mill's works, for instance, you can find him a little bit, what I might say, with all due respect to Mill, a little bit sloppy. And well, again, to be fair, I mean, Mill wrote this stuff, and then scholars just pick over it like crazy, and then we eventually start noticing, slight deviations and whatnot, and a looseness of terminology, and maybe certain themes that are not quite identical being used as if they perfectly fit together, and maybe they don't. All right, so as sometimes the postmodernists would say, there is an inherent play in the text. Sure, there is something to that, and you find this in Kant, you find this in Aristotle, and that is basically the foundation of scholarship, is that it's possible to interpret these authors in various ways. So, but you can find vague and ambiguous statements, like in Hutchinson and Bentham, when they talk about the greatest happiness for greatest numbers. That action is best which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. It suggests that we concentrate on the sheer number of recipients rather than the total, or should we concentrate on the total? So this raises the question of the problems of distribution, and which one should you look for? Should you look for good averages, or should you look for total amounts of happiness? So average happiness, total amount. How would you distinguish between the two within the confines of a utilitarian style thinking? That's another important thing, is sometimes, and what I'm going to suggest is a problem with the play in these texts, is that in order to get the utilitarian sort of position off the ground, you might have to incorporate maybe non-utilitarian suggestions. Anyway, so this is all quite debatable, but that's what makes it also interesting. Now, I'm going to jump ahead, because of course Mill's a 19th century writer, and we're talking about utilitarianism in the 20th century. In Richard Brandt, a great 20th century utilitarian, a very influential philosopher, in his important work, Ethical Theory, of 1959, he introduces, okay, you've got to be careful with this, he introduces the term act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Now, as we go, we'll unpack what these terms mean, but basically they're different ways or modes of interpreting utilitarianism, what you're supposed to look at in terms of evaluating consequences. Now, prior to Brandt, to be historically accurate, it had been known, again, this is the play in Mill's text, it had been known that Mill was not always clear as to what, when he talked about, well, we have to look at the consequences of something, he wasn't always clear as to what that something was. Sometimes he talked as if, well, what we do is we look at the consequences of an action. I do something, there's consequences. That's what I look at when I'm determining whether or not that action is okay or wrong or whatever. So that is, well, we're looking at actions. It naturally would sound, well, that's an act utilitarianism. Right. But sometimes Mill sounds like we're talking about looking at the results of certain rules. So we look at the consequences of having certain rules in place. So, and we often do this. We say, well, what is it better to have a rule saying that you take your library books back on time or not. So we look at the consequences of rules sometimes. So it's not the case, simply put, it's not the case that Mill was always clear as to what kind of cause, is it an action or a rule, that we're determining and evaluating and examining the consequences of, right? So sometimes it could be one thing or another. He's not always clear on that one. And of course, remember, when we do consider consequences, the consequences don't just immediately reveal themselves. We have to make decisions based on what we see within namely, we have to make distinctions within our experience as to what is going to count as a consequence and for how long, right? Because every action could have consequences for thousands of years. Are you going to weigh all of those? And where do you stop with the boundary of an action's consequences and a rule's consequence? Because remember, a rule can be quite an artificial and abstract entity and can have all kinds of consequences. Where do you put the boundaries on these things? So there's lots of room for interpretation as to what Mill thought. And so your face, though, my point, at least at this place, is that that Mill is not always entirely clear here. Now, Henry West, a scholar of utilitarianism and a Mill scholar as well, in about 2004, in his work, Introduction to Mill's Utilitarian Ethics, lovely little book, has a lot of interesting stuff in it. In one of the chapters, he points out that if you take how do these relate? That is, what kind of distinction are we making within utilitarianism? So utilitarianism not only goes off in different directions, it's not even clear how the directions that it goes, how they relate to each other. And so what West asks is, well, how do these relate to each other? And he says something like this, vis-a-vis, where is Mill in with respect to this? And I said, sometimes he talks like an act utilitarian, sometimes he talks like a rule utilitarian. Well, West in this book argues that if you take these two as complete and independent and exclusive of each other, that is, they're watertight little theories, then Mill is neither of them. But if you regard them as forms of utilitarian reasoning, and he goes on to unpack what that is about, he says then Mill he partakes in both of these forms, and he does a lot more. So, but it's not, at the end of it all, it's not self-evident exactly how these modes or theories of utilitarianism, how they relate to each other. Now, again, as I said, Mill is a bit ambiguous in places and vague. In his lovely little work, Utilitarianism, which is often read and taught, which he himself didn't regard as his major work. Mill, in one of his letters towards the end of his life, figured he would be remembered for his book on a rather large book on logic, which very few people read today. It's quite outdated, but it's an interesting read. He thought he would be remembered for that and not his ethics like utilitarianism. He thought that was just a little throwaway line. It basically was serialized in a magazine. But anyways, it's nonetheless still a great little work, well worth reading. But in that work, Mill says, acts are right. And I just plucked this out because this is his kind of his definition of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says that acts are right in proportion as, and they tend to promote happiness. So it's right if it tends to promote happiness, and wrong, notice he's talking about acts here, and wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. So a couple of things to think about here. What Mill doesn't really do for us, which would have been helpful, is how do we calculate these proportions, right? How do you calculate those proportions? And what do you mean by tend, like a tendency? Mill and the early classic utilitarians will often talk about tendencies, but they don't really spell it out, right? And they're certainly not giving us what contemporary ethicists want is a much more precise answer. So but you can see, you can kind of hear that the possible mathematization of this, because you have words like proportion and tendency. Well, those sound very much like statistical type notions. Maybe not proportion, but certainly a tendency sounds like a statistical notion. Well, Mill didn't have that kind of mathematics at his fingertips, and he probably wasn't really thinking that you could do that. But in any case, put that aside for a second, he didn't, right? He didn't give these full-blown statistical explanations in his work. That comes out in the 20th century in the pursuit of precision in utilitarianism. So you have those tendencies, and this is only the beginning of the, shall we say, the analysis of Mill's work in terms of the analysis of breaking it down into its component part and examining them. So in the next video, we'll take a little bit more of a dive into some of these component parts that 20th century utilitarians have found within Mill's work.